was the story of Ric Flair connected you guys in 1994. You bring him to WCW. Talk a little bit about negotiating with Hulk Hogan on that deal. How challenging it was, how difficult it was to get it to work.
It's two different stories, really. Dealing with Hulk Hogan as a person was very easy because he's a nice guy. He's a very generous person. He's easy to deal with. He doesn't put on a show in a negotiation. A lot of times you're negotiating. Thank you so much. A lot of times you deal with people and they go into a negotiation acting like they have to present themselves in a certain way, and it's not real. Hulk was the opposite. He was very open, very honest. However, he had an attorney by the name of Henry Holmes, who was a animal. He's just an animal. And that part was very, very difficult. That being said, they were very clear right from the very beginning. Here's what this deal has to look like. These are our parameters. And there wasn't a lot of room for negotiation. Fortunately, Ted Turner was very committed. Bill Shaw, who was my boss at the time, who worked for Ted Turner, made sure that I had the resources that I need and as much support as I possibly could get from Turner Broadcasting to make the deal happen. So it was tough because they were tough, but I think the whole process only took about 60 days, which is not a long time for a deal like that.
And I mean, what was there a lot of trades that WCW had to make to get him? How important was it for WCW to get that deal?
It was critical because, let me back up just a little bit. When I was hired as executive producer, and I think that was about 1993, I was hired in that position because Bill Watts, who had formerly been the executive vice president of WCW, said and did some really stupid things that provided a lot of embarrassment for Turner Broadcasting. He made some very stupid racial comments very publicly, and all of that got back to Ted Turner and to a gentleman by the name of Hank Aaron. And if you don't know who Hank Aaron is in the United States, Hank Aaron is a Major League Baseball legend. And Hank Aaron had an office right down the hall from Ted Turner. So when the comments that Bill Watts made very publicly, and they were very racial and very tasteless, made their way back to Ted Turner, Bill Watts got fired. Ted Turner himself was very embarrassed. The company was embarrassed. And Ted appointed Bill Shaw. I know this is complicated and maybe boring, but I want to give you the background. Bill Shaw was the vice president of human resources at the time. So Ted said to Bill Shaw, Bill, I want you to fire Bill Watts, take over WCW, and we're either going to make this thing work, it's either going to turn a profit, or we're going to pull the plug. That was important because up until that point, the only reason that WCW existed was because Ted Turner really believed in WCW. All of the other senior executives in Turner Broadcasting at that time really wanted to get rid of it. They had tried to talk Ted into getting rid of WCW, but Ted was adamant. He was determined to keep WCW as a part of Turner Broadcasting. But at this point that I'm referring to in 1993, even Ted Turner had had his fill. So the challenge was to turn WCW around as quickly and professionally as possible with the least amount of embarrassment. So Bill Shaw came down to the WCW offices one day and he just basically read us the riot act. Now, Bill was a very nice Southern gentleman, but he made it very clear that WCW was either going to turn around and turn a profit very soon or Ted was going to pull the plug. Okay. So I ended up getting the job. I was promoted once or twice along the way. We actually started at least appearing as though there was a half a chance that we could make a profit. And I went to Bill Shaw one day and said, what if we could bring Hulk Hogan in? Because that would be the one, like the big domino, that if we could get that domino, there would be other dominoes that would fall along the way. And Bill was very supportive of it. He went to Ted Turner, got Ted Turner's support, and bringing Hulk in was really the thing that there was a series of, it was like a chain of events that happened after Hulk Hogan. First, Hulk Hogan came, well, back it up even further. I started producing television shows at the Disney MGM studios, which to the wrestling fans, it didn't matter. In fact, a lot of them really didn't like the idea because it was Disney MGM or wrestling, that doesn't fit. But from a business perspective and from a financial perspective, it made a lot of sense. So we started doing things that made sense business-wise so that when Hulk Hogan, the opportunity for Hulk Hogan became real, Ted had a lot more confidence in WCW than he had a year earlier and was willing to make it happen. And once Hulk came in, guess who followed in his footsteps? Oh, yeah, snap into a little Randy Savage, brother. You're probably not familiar with the Slim Jim commercials, but Randy Savage was a spokesperson for Slim Jim for a long time. Randy Savage came in, and by the way, Slim Jim came in right behind him. Randy Savage's contract was $750,000 a year. That's what I signed Randy for. The Slim Jim sponsorship was $750,000 a year. I got Randy for free, and I got a deal on Slim Jims.
And when you bring Hulk in, his first programs with Ric Flair, you guys do pay-per-views together. Were the results in WCW instant? Were you seeing results financially and all that straight away when you got?
That's a really, really good question. Really good question. There was a lot of curiosity. There was a lot of buzz. There was a lot of awareness amongst wrestling fans that Hulk Hogan was coming in and he was going to be working with Ric Flair. So the first pay-per-view did really well. But interestingly enough, television ratings didn't move a whole lot. There were two classifications of wrestling fans. There were the former or current WWE fans, and there were current WCW fans. And the WCW fan base was much, much smaller than the WWE fan base. So when Hulk Hogan first came in, a lot of that WWE fan base that never really watched WCW, because at the time it was considered to be kind of Southern wrestling, you know, kind of small regional country boy wrestling, whereas the WWE was perceived to be a big international brand. But a lot of that WWE audience came to sample us. They wanted to see Hulk Hogan at WCW. Wow, that's weird. Let's go check it out. And they did. But once the newness of it wore off, we started seeing the television audience kind of go back down to where it was. The big difference was on the business-to-business side, meaning advertisers, potential sponsors, the pay-per-view partnerships we had. Why is that important? For example, when we do a pay-per-view prior to Hulk Hogan, it was a 60-40. So if we sold the pay-per-view for $30, the pay-per-view company would get 60% of that, we would get 40%. Once Hulk Hogan came on board, I was able to flip that. Now we're getting 60% and they're getting 40%. So right off the bat, we're making a greater profit margin on our pay-per-views just because we have Hulk Hogan. Now at that point in time, we're probably making around $2 million a pay-per-view. Well, that's $200,000 a pay-per-view that we got to raise. So that's where Hulk started paying off big dividends very quickly, was on the business-to-business side.
When Hulk came in, followed people like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Honky Tonk Man, the Nasty Boys, all people who had been in WWF, had been there for a while. I'm guessing that was maybe part of the deal, and that to get Hulk, you kind of have to have some people that he feels comfortable with. What was that like?
The only person that was part of the deal contractually was Jimmy Hart. Jimmy Hart was the only person that you mentioned, and there were more than you mentioned, that was actually part of the contract. Jimmy had his own contract, and it was referenced in Hulk's contract. The rest of it kind of happened organically, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Hulk had a lot of influence, right? And part of the position that I was in, as anybody that's ever managed talent will be able to tell you, no matter how much they dislike the fact that they have to admit it, But when you've got a key piece of talent like a Hulk Hogan, or if it's an actor or an actress or probably a football player here, or a rugby player, if you've got a big star, that big star has a certain amount of influence. And Hulk had influence. So a lot of those names I brought in to kind of keep the big star happy, because Hulk felt comfortable with that group of people around him. Hulk is a very unique person. He's a larger-than-life character. And, if you go back and you look at him, late 70s when he was first breaking in, or early 80s, mid-80s, certainly by the late 80s and early 90s, he was a larger-than-life character. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He was on, he was the most, other than probably Muhammad Ali at the time, one of the most recognized characters in the world. But it's interesting sometimes how people like that are, in some ways, insecure, to the extent that they want to be surrounded with people that they're comfortable with, that they know and they can trust. And that's how Hulk was able to influence me to bring in, not all of those names. Some of those names I thought did have their own value. They all had value, some more than others. But like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Hacksaw was at the end of his career by that point in time. He certainly wasn't at the peak of it, right? But the audio, if you go back and watch some of the shows, if you could find them from 94, 95, when Hacksaw would come out, the crowd reacted. He was almost a nostalgia act at that time, but they really, really loved him. Nasty Boys. I hadn't known the Nasty Boys. I first met them in 1987, right after I went to work for Vern Gagne. They were working for Vern Gagne at the same time. They were like the first wrestlers I ever hung out with, which probably explains a lot. At least explains my liver and my gray hair. But they were a contribution. The Nasty Boys were very popular in New Japan and worked regularly over in Japan. So that was another thing that made it easy for me to transition into doing business with New Japan. So they had value. Brutus the Barber Beefcake and Honky Tonk Man, not so much.
Well, because I was going to ask you, because one of the famous examples is Hacksaw Jim Duggan beat Steve Austin for the US title. And when I was going to ask you about the mid-carders in WCW. How were they feeling? Was there any reaction from them seeing nostalgia acts come in? Did they feel threatened? Because obviously Steve Austin has been quite public about his displeasure at that point with maybe dropping the belt to Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Yeah, I didn't book that. I think Dusty may have been the booker at that time. Could have been Ric Flair. Not really sure. It's hard for me to... It's been a minute. I remember Steve coming up to me one night, and this was before I was the head of creative, or the booker, as it's referred to sometimes. Steve Austin came up to me one time. We were still taping shows at the Center Stage Theater in downtown Atlanta for our WCW Saturday Night Show, which at that time, this is before Nitro. At the time, that was our kind of flagship show. And Steve Austin came up to me, and this was right after Hulk Hogan got there. He said, "Eric, I got this great idea. I'm going to be Hulk Hogan's little brother. We can be a tag team, and then I'll turn on him," or something like that. I went, wow. But I wasn't the head of creative at the time. I said, well, let me pass that on, and we'll see where that goes. Now, I knew in my mind, because one of the things when Hulk Hogan came in, you mentioned Ric Flair, and as I talked about, Hulk was very big on working with people that he trusted. One of the reasons that Ric Flair was so instrumental in allowing us to bring Hulk Hogan in is that Hulk Hogan really trusted Ric Flair inside of the ring. He really knew that if once that bell rang, that Ric Flair would do everything in his ability, which was a lot, to make Hulk Hogan look great. Hulk didn't know Steve Austin. There was no way Hulk was going to get into the ring with Steve Austin anytime in the immediate future. So Steve Austin pitches the idea to me. I took it to whoever I took it to. I think it might have been Dusty, or whoever it was. Dusty or Rick decided, we're going to have Steve Austin lose to Hacksaw Jim Duggan. That was probably the tipping point for Steve Austin. As far as the rest of the locker room, I would say it was split down the middle. You know, a lot of the people that were in WCW at the time had formerly worked for WWE when Hulk Hogan was there, a number of them. They knew that where Hulk Hogan went, the money followed. They wanted to be a part of that. So I would say it was maybe not 50-50, but I would say there was probably 60% of the people were afraid for their jobs, afraid for their position, because not only because of Hulk, because of the people that Hulk was bringing in, but the other 40% were like, you know, this could be really good business for us in the future. And they were supportive.